everyone, Michaela here to talk to you about an early Georgian arrangement. Our Garden Club of Alexandria and Hunting Creek Garden Club both have a shared schedule created by Laura Francis and Jordan Richards. And this month's, October's arrangement is inspired by a porcelain piece, a beautiful creamware centerpiece by Leeds Pottery. I'm going to show you a picture of the centerpiece. And this should inspire not only the shape of the arrangement, but possibly the container. You can see creamware obviously is white. So when I was choosing my container, I was looking for something that might evoke that feel without being literal. I've got two options that I'm going to show you here, and you can see that I've leaned towards this one. They're both a footed shape, and I think because the early Georgian arrangement is a triangular mass, I always like to go with a footed shape because it allows that triangle as it emerges from the container to really have a great sense of form. And form is one of the elements that we're focusing on today. So it distinguishes the container from the form of the arrangement. Also notice scale. This is not a huge container. When you go big, you need a lot of flowers. This is a flower intensive style of arranging. So I've actually chosen to go a little bit smaller, and both of these containers are that. This one is actually the base of a tulipier. There's a triangular piece that actually sits on top, and it's got holes around that you can put your tulips in. I'm gonna use it a little bit differently today, obviously, to create this early Georgian arrangement. And just briefly talking about the Georgian style, there are two different styles that are defined in the GCV Floral Arranging Handbook under the traditional historical arrangements, early Georgian and late Georgian. These are examples of Georgian arrangements. Again, you can see there's a very triangular form. Really the difference between the early Georgian and the late Georgian is that the early Georgian is more inspired by the Dutch and Flemish arrangements, which were just a little bulkier and more massive. And the late Georgian leans a little bit more towards a loose and airier French style. They both have a triangular shape. So we're gonna go with this today. Most of the competition arrangements you'll see in the Garden Club of Virginia are going to be the late Georgian style. However, we're sticking with the early Georgian, so it's going to be just a little more massive. You really should see that triangular shape and less kind of flowy airiness in this one. The other principle that we're focusing on today is the principle of scale. And I think that relates really nicely because it's so important in this case to have a scale of your arrangement that suits the scale of your container. So again, both of these are a little smaller in size. The guidelines for the Georgian are that the arrangement itself should be 1 to 1.5 times the height of the container. So again, going with a smaller container is really going to serve you well in this. And I'm going to launch right into talking about my mechanics and work on creating this arrangement because there's a lot of flowers that are going into this. So mechanics first. This is the most important piece of your arrangement in many ways because you need to think about a couple things. One, you need to make sure your flowers have a water source. Two, you need to be able to create this triangle shape that basically sits on top of your container. So if you put your mechanics inside your container, you're not going to be able to bring that out on the sides of the container. So what I've done here is I've actually, and I know this is using Oasis, I tried to minimize it, but frankly, in this situation, there aren't very many ways you're going to get that water to the flower stems without using Oasis. So what I did is I created, it's a pretty open base at the bottom. So I actually stacked a little piece of Oasis, and then I created kind of a tubular piece that I sliced down around the sides so that I could sit it on top. And you can see here, it's actually extending a little bit over the edges of the opening of the container in the middle. Then I created a cage out of chicken wire that I attached with clear plastic tape. Now, this actually is going to make it pretty easy for me to cover my mechanics because they don't go over the edge of the container. So anytime you do that, and actually if I was doing this one, I'd probably try to get my mechanics kind of sticking up but inside the top of this and then use the tape to secure it around the base. You'll have some pieces that come around the base and you can hide your clear tape. But you've got to be able to secure that floral foam. And the reason for the cage is that the floral foam, once it starts getting a lot of holes in it, which it will because we're using a lot of flowers, it's going to hold it in place. Okay, so 3 types of materials I want to focus on today. One is what I'm going to call the architecture. You need to create that triangular shape, so you need some flowers that are straight and stiff stemmed. I have chosen Snapdragon today. Some of them have a little bit of a curvier end. This one seemed pretty straight up, so that's actually going to be what I use to define my architecture. And I'm going to go ahead and remember we're 1 to 1.5 times the height of the arrangement, so that looks pretty good to me. And I'm just going to start that off right in the middle, making sure it's secure. All right. The other type of flower that we're going to focus on is kind of the focal flowers. Now, one of the parts of the description of the Georgian is there's really no single focal flower. It's not about the individual flower, it's about the mass. So I found this beautiful bouquet at the farmer's market in Old Town. And note that this is monochromatic, another hallmark of this style. I'm doing pinks and purples with a little bit of accent of white. Lots of texture, lots of fullness, early fall flowers. The third type of component for this is what I'm calling filler. So I've got architecture, I've got flower, and I've got filler. So I found this also at the farmer's market, which is just sort of a loose and flowy, I'm not even sure what it is, to be honest, but it's going to give me a lot of flexibility because it's a long stemmed piece, but it's got lots of other stems extending out of it, so I can cut this and fill it any way I like. The other thing is my trusty fern, which is actually an indoor plant that I have, but I've just cut off some fern fronds that I'm going to be able to kind of pull the leaves off the base and create the pieces that I need to come out and over the edges. So I'm just going to talk and arrange, and we'll have a good time. So with these snapdragons, sometimes they're going to be a little full, so feel free. In this case, another good flower for this is a gladiola if you've got a bigger container. But I'm going to go ahead and define my triangle. And you should always remember you want to do your whole arrangement in this case. So I'm just going to take it all the way around the outside, and you see how there's nice stiff stems. I'm just stripping all the leaves off. You don't need these leaves because it's basically going to be covered with other flowers as we progress. And as I do this, simply because this is such a big arrangement, we're going to get you to the point where you can continue to fill once I stop. To get to a finished arrangement, and I'll make sure you all have pictures of the finished arrangement so you can see. You see how the flowers have emerged a little bit more on this one? I'm actually just going to pluck some of the lower pieces off just to keep it kind of in scale. So I'm defining the 3-dimensional 4 corners of my arrangement. I think on this one I'm actually going to make it wider than I'm going to make it deep. And you do want to be thoughtful because remember we've got a lot of flowers going into not a lot of oasis. So you do want to be thoughtful about your placement, simply because the more times you poke into that oasis, the fewer chances you're going to have to redo it. All right, so I've kind of got my 4 corners. And then I'm going to give myself some height along the sides. And it's sort of fun for us to be doing a historical arrangement because of late a lot of the garden club directive has been more of the contemporary styles, but this is really kind of our roots, so we need to make sure we're not forgetting where we came from, and it also does give you an interesting way to kind of view the evolution of flower arranging. The nice thing about some of the more contemporary arrangement is they don't require so much of a mass of flowers. But when you have that summer profusion, it's awfully nice to be able to create something like this. All right, so you see I'm kind of getting my triangle shape wider than it is deep. I'm actually going to bring this down a little bit just to keep it more shallow. But here's my architecture coming to life. And one of the earliest things I learned when I was learning to arrange flowers was you have to finish the back. This isn't necessarily, I don't think it specifies in the schedule that it must be viewed from all sides. However, if you lose that depth from the back, it just never looks finished. So don't forget to do the back. I think these, just in keeping with the triangular form, this guy could be just a little shorter, front and back, because I don't want it to end up being a cone. A cone is more reminiscent of the Dutch and Flemish style that you see in those still lifes, the Dutch still lifes. So this really wants to be a triangle. Okay, so you can see, I'm just gonna turn it. You can see it's not as wide. All right, so I've kind of got my triangular shape happening here. That was the last of my snapdragons. So I'm gonna start putting some flowers in. And I usually do in this order with the architecture, then the flowers. I've got a plethora of flowers here to work with. So I'm just gonna pull these out. And again, I'm not as good with the horticulture, so I'm not gonna have all the names, but I know we've got some dahlias, which are kind of the focal point, and some fun buttons and some cosmos. Look at this one that has this fun fringy shape. So I'm gonna start filling in my triangle. Oops. And again, this is just gonna take some ingenuity to find the best shapes and sizes. But you can see the nice thing about having variety is you get different shapes that are gonna fill in. And remember, this type of arrangement is not about one type of flower. You're much better off with creating a variety. It does, however, want symmetrical balance. So as I'm putting in flowers, I'm kind of trying to focus on pairs of stems. And already this early on in the game, I'm starting to feel it's getting tight in my floral foam. So just have to be really thoughtful about my placement and try to hit it one time instead of 2 or 3 times. And when you do have some bigger flowers, I had some really big flowers that I actually am not going to be able to use. They're beautiful dahlias, but they just simply are too big for my purposes today. But here I am filling it out, trying to do the same thing on both sides, trying to use my wonderful variety of flowers. I've got a couple of little white stems in here, which are going to be really nice to kind of fill in the middle. Always remembering, and this one I'm cutting down a little bit just because it's super full, but I'll be able to circle back and reuse these little fellas when I fill in later. I'm just focusing on making sure I've got the full variety on both sides. I've got my symmetrical balance. I'm keeping my triangle shape, filling, filling, filling. And when I do have some bigger flowers like these, I'm going to focus on filling the front. Just building and cutting to make sure that triangular shape stays in play. But I'm starting to get a little monochromatic balance. I've got one more interesting type I'm going to add in here. This one has a lot of leaves, so I'm just kind of taking those off until I get to the point where I feel like it's the right amount of leafy to flowery. But it actually creates kind of some nice fullness in there. And great contrast actually as I'm looking at it in the video. So I think I'm going to try to, because it has a pointy end, I'm actually going to try to tuck it in because it's going to help define my shape a little bit. The other thing that can come in handy here, and I did have one of these when I started, but it's lost itself, is a floral pick, a skewer, or even a stem of a flower that has a stiff end, because sometimes like this particular flower is a little, it's not quite as stiff, and in fact it's kind of bulky, so I'm going to cut it down a little bit. But oftentimes going in with either another flower or a skewer kind of paves the way for it to go in, there we go, a little more gently. And you see how droopy it is? I might want to come back in with another flower that's going to give that a little boost, just so it helps me maintain the shape a little bit. That's why I love those snapdragons for the form, because they really hold their shape nicely. All right, I'm going to pause here with the floral material, and I'm going to just show you a little bit about how we can add some filler, and then we'll come back at the end to look at more of a finished product. Okay, so I've got two kinds of filler. I've got this wonderful little feathery kind of purpley tone, which still fits into my monochromatic palette, but what it's going to do is it's going to help me fill in that oasis, maintain that overall shape as I continue to add more and more floral material to this mass. And remember, it starts out big like this, and I'm cutting it down into smaller pieces. It's also nice because the stems are really thin, so they're just going to tuck in there real nicely. This is a challenge, as you can imagine, to do from the front, much less from the back, so there will be some assessing that has to go into this before it gets to the final form. Come on. But this is great because it's really taking up some visual space, but it's also allowing me to keep that triangular form. It can sit a little bit closer in, because again, we're trying to fill. We're trying to reiterate that shape, but also fill that void that the oasis creates when it's sitting above the edge of the container like this. And you're starting to see less and less oasis as I put more and more material in. The other one that I love here, like I said, is this fern, which is going to give me a little bit of airiness, both extending down like that, or this is a really curly one, you know, or coming up and out just to fill in the middle. I'm going to put a couple bigger flowers in, and then I'm actually going to pause, allow you guys to catch up and assess this a little more closely myself. So here's a bigger guy, you can fit right here in the middle. And I try not to get too much actually interrupting that triangular line, because we just want to make sure it's longer this way and taller this way, with the bulk of the flowers coming down and around. I also love to use flowers that just have a bud. You can see this one, it's just that bud of the dahlia. And I'm just going to trim off one of the leaves. And again, it just gives me a little fill. It needs to be a little shorter. A little fill in there and a little softness. All right, I'm going to pause, but you can see This is starting to take shape. I'm going to come back when it's got better shape and talk a little bit more about the form and the elements. All right, back again with the finished arrangement. So what I did while we were apart was I just continued to define my triangle. I really leaned into these snapdragons to create the long points. Sometimes I pulled them up or pushed them in a little bit just to define the shape. I filled in with all my bigger floral color material that creates that monochromatic palette. And then I filled in at the end with ferns and with our purple filler. I think it's maybe Status or something related. I don't think it's heather, but anyway, it was a great shape because it was actually triangular in form to begin with. So it really helped me kind of define the outlines of my triangle. I focused on massing the flowers in the middle because remember, the early Georgian is meant to be a little fuller, less airy. So I really wanted the bulk of that in the middle. I focused on my symmetrical balance, making sure my color was distributed and my shape was consistent, and just made sure my mechanics were covered. I did want to and the other thing that was important about this type of arrangement is there's no real one flower focus. So I tried to distribute things that balanced it asymmetrically but didn't really highlight one single flower. You can see when I turn it around, and I did finish the back, I had a couple flowers that were really big. So I used those in the back, which is not the part that's being judged, so that it fills, you get the color that seeps all the way through. But if this were to be the front, you can see that this flower would be too much of a focal point, whereas the flowers that I ended up using in the front are a little smaller and more balanced. So again, triangular shape, symmetrical balance, monochromatic color. We focused on form, which is the actual shape of the arrangement as it relates to the container, and we focused on scale, which is how big the arrangement is as it relates to the container. And you can see, if I just use kind of my hands, this is the height of the container. I'm about 1.5 times the height of the container. The bulk of it is actually pretty close to the actual height of the container, and then the points of my triangle extend out. So I hope that helps you see what a finished early Georgian arrangement can look like, and I hope you enjoy making your own.